One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be in Australia.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Eleanor Johnston-Leake, a digital content creator here at the Australia Institute, and this week, while Parliament is off for the midwinter break, we'll be listening back to an episode from our webinar series. The last federal election was dubbed the climate election, with Labor, the Greens and Independents all campaigning on improving on the climate policy of the Morrison government, and the Albanese government has since made several changes to Australia's climate policy, but some elements of these policies might actually be causing more harm than good. A cornerstone of the Albanese government's climate policy involves the use of carbon credits to reduce net emissions. Carbon credits are made by carrying out activities that store, reduce, or avoid greenhouse gas emissions, such as retaining vegetation instead of clearing it, or capturing gas from landfill. But many of these carbon credits might not actually represent any reduction in emissions. Former editor of The Monthly, Nick Feik, sat down with our Deputy Director, Ebony Bennett, and our Climate and Energy Program Director, Polly Hemming, to unpack his new book, The Great Stock and Coal Swindle.
G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. In his new essay for The Monthly titled The Great Stock and Coal Swindle, Nick Feik has taken a deep dive into just how much the fossil fuel industry shapes Australia's climate policy, including some of its clean energy bodies, as well as some environment organisation. And he dives right into the issue of carbon offsets. We're delighted to have Nick Feik join us today. Nick is a writer and journalist and the former editor of The Monthly. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning. Great to be here.
And Polly Hemming is director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. She's done a huge amount of work on carbon offsets, greenwashing, and a huge number of other things. So she'll be joining us today to get into the minutiae of policy if we need it and help explain things we don't understand. Thanks for joining us, Polly Hemming.
Thanks, Eb.
So, Nick, I will just recommend this thoroughly to everyone who's on the line with us. It's in this month's issue of The Monthly. This is what the essay looks like. I had a PDF copy of it, and basically all of it is highlighted. It's quite a forensic look at this whole issue, and I've rarely seen it laid out in such easy to understand terms. I wondered if you could just talk to me a little bit about why you chose to do this essay. And, you know, it's called The Stock and Coal Swindle. The subtitle is The Shell Game Behind Carbon Credits. Is that really what we're talking about here? A swindle, a shell game?
Look, I think it is. That was the original title that I had, that I'd been working with, The Shell Game, partly obviously because of the reference to Shell. But look, the way that it came about, it actually came from Richard Dennis as a general. My interest in the subject followed a conversation with him where he was sort of starting to paint the picture in ways that I hadn't fully understood. And carbon offsets is one of those subjects where if you say carbon offsets to people, you can see their eyes start to glaze over. Like same with safeguard mechanism. It's like the whole system is designed to repel interest. And but I started looking into the area, and I read a lot of Polly's work, a lot of the work from the Australia Institute and other people, and started looking at the connections between the industry. So between the regulators in Australia, as in the Climate Change Authority, the Clean Energy Regulator, ARENA, the CEFC, and then what if there were connections with the carbon offset industry, the carbon credits, the aggregators, so the likes of Green Collar and AgriProve and all these companies that you've never heard of, but that they dominate this scheme. And then if there are any connections to fossil fuel companies, it turned out, you know, unbeknownst to me, unbeknownst to almost everyone, there are significant connections both between the regulators and the carbon credits industry, as in the head of the Climate Change Authority is also the chair of the biggest carbon credit aggregator, Grant King. I mean, if that's not a conflict of interest, he's advising the government on how to abate carbon. That's just, to me, that alone is a disqualifying factor for him. But there are several other people in the Climate Change Authority who have links to the carbon credits industry. And then there are lots and lots of investors of shareholdings from gas companies in particular in carbon credit aggregators. And so when I sort of started to map these things out, the picture that emerged is quite an ugly one. And it gets uglier when you sort of trace these policies back a few years, as in the safeguard mechanism obviously is based on a coalition policy, also called the safeguard mechanism, which was designed essentially by, under the Morrison government, following on from Tony Abbott's direct action policy. All the markings of that policy are still built into the current policy. You still have the same people who designed the safeguard mechanism under Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison. Those systems are still built into the current legislation. I mean, we can go into the legislation, but to me, there are so many problems with the offset industry, with the carbon credits industry, and they all date back to really bad decisions earlier when Australia didn't have a climate policy. And the idea of a climate policy was, from the coalition, was how do you make a climate policy that looks like it's doing something, but is actually just a license for gas companies in particular to keep expanding. That's unfortunately, I know we'll get into the details, but that's unfortunately what I believe the current safeguard mechanism is doing too.
Yeah. So, Polly, maybe we should come now to you for a bit of an explanation before we dive into the real details here. Nick's uncovered some really important close connections that raise questions about the governance of all of these kinds of industries and credits and offsets. But can you just tell us what is a carbon credit compared to an offset before we begin, so everyone is clear what we're talking about? What's a carbon credit and what is a carbon offset?
Yeah, sure. They're used interchangeably, but they are slightly different. Carbon credits are generated by activities that avoid or store carbon across the economy. And there's sort of voluntary frameworks. In Australia, the Australian government, so we have a regulated framework. The Australian government gives Australian carbon credit units, which are also called ACCUs. So if you hear us talking about ACCUs, we mean carbon credits. They give them to projects for carrying out various abatement or emissions reductions or avoidance activities across the economy. And the whole scheme was originally meant to provide an incentive for businesses or individuals or landholders to adopt new practices and technologies to do things that would avoid or store carbon. And for every tonne of carbon that was stored or avoided, these projects would be given a carbon credit. And most projects occur across the land sector through vegetation management. That's not planting trees. Most people think that it's from planting trees. It's avoiding, it's just not cutting trees down or sort of putting a fence around a block of land and allowing the trees to regenerate. And when you're given that carbon credit by the government or internationally by some other voluntary framework, it's still just a credit, right? It's just sort of a token representing that tonne of reduction. You can sell that carbon credit to a business seeking to offset their emissions. So essentially, the idea is you have reduced your emissions. Another business doesn't have to. They can emit a tonne of CO2 and they buy your carbon credit. And on paper, that theoretically balances everything out. That's assuming that the carbon credit actually does represent that reduction.
Yeah, so we might get into some of the issues that have been raised around the integrity of offsets and credits a bit later. But just to be clear, what's the trade-off here that we're talking about? Can offsets actually reduce emissions, Polly? At
a system level, no. Like at an economy-wide level, no. It may be at an individual project, like if you have a farmer who is planting a tree or not cutting down a tree, then yes, a tonne of CO2 has been avoided or reduced. But if a business is buying that carbon credit to justify emitting a ton of CO2, nothing is actually reduced. The best that can ever be achieved by purchasing offsets is maintaining the status quo. And that's, again, assuming they have integrity. So every business that is buying offsets year on year, instead of actually decarbonising or reducing their emissions, they're effectively just treading water, and Australia's emissions are staying the same. You know, we're shuffling numbers around in columns in a spreadsheet, but we haven't actually reduced anything. And I'd go further, every dollar that is spent on an offset is a dollar that's not spent on permanent displacement of fossil fuels. And the government also buys carbon credits to try and reach Australia's climate targets. Or they used to, I don't know if they will anymore. But if they're buying land-based carbon credits, very important to support farmers and Indigenous communities and biodiversity, but they're not spending the money on decarbonisation initiatives either.
But Nick, I want to come back to you. You were kind of talking there about once you started looking into this, you were a bit shocked by how close the connections are between the fossil fuel industry and not just kind of government and those processes, but regulators and also as part of this offsets industry. Can you just unpack for us a little bit about what you found and how deep those connections go with the fossil fuel industry?
Well, put it this way, all of the largest carbon aggregators that I looked at either had ex-resources, ex-gas resources board members or shareholders from gas companies.
Can I just, sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, do you just want to explain what an aggregator is?
What I mean is a carbon trader, as in the people that either go to farmers and say, "I'll give you, we'll pay you to, not clear this land, or we'll pay you to move your," and then collect. It's a very complex system. It's deliberately opaque, really. But carbon aggregators are the people that broker all of the deals about carbon credits. So, buying them at auctions or bidding for them at auctions, delivering them, this whole sort of merry-go-round, which happens. But essentially, all of the dealers in carbon credits have links to the gas industry. And when you think about it, this makes total sense. From a commercial perspective, if you need to invest in carbon credits, if you need to buy offsets, you might as well be making money on the other end of the deal as well, right? So they've invested. It's so much cheaper, right? You need that. The gas industry in particular needs carbon credits. So they know that there's going to be a demand for carbon credits. It's going to rise as the safeguard mechanism kicks in, regardless, I think, of what happens. There's going to be a demand for carbon offsets in the future. So they all know that they need carbon credits. So I think some of them are investing. The sort of uglier part of the connections in this world are, to me, the fact that there are people moving in and out of NGOs, environmental NGOs and regulators and the carbon credits business in ways that I think are conflicts of interest. So people who are formerly on the boards of like WWF Australia, of the ACF, former presidents of, often they have, they're still working in the carbon credits trade. They have carbon offsets projects. A lot of the NGOs themselves, from like the conservation, Nature Conservancy through to Pew and all of these other groups, actually have had carbon offsets projects themselves. So regenerating land, which is a good thing, collecting credits, and then those credits ending up with gas companies so that they don't have to cut their own emissions. This is a terrible idea. I mean, so when I look at the offsets industry, I think the more credits that people put into this system, everyone thinks they're doing a good thing, right? Abating carbon in the atmosphere. Every single one of those at the moment is going to be used as an excuse to emit more carbon. And so it's not only the fact that none of these carbon credits are doing good, they're actually enabling worse. And all this is regardless of the fact, this doesn't even take into account the fact that for a project, for the big gas projects like that Woodside have, the new ones that are coming online, we're not even counting 90% of the emissions that come from gas projects. If you're exporting 100% of your gas or 80% of your gas or whatever, all of that gas that goes offshore, none of it is counted in our system.
Yeah.
So what we're essentially doing is we're asking companies to offset 5% of 10% when the 90% is not even counted. So so one offset, and this is the figure that Climate Analytics came up with, was that every offset that's used to offset a gas that's used by the gas industry is offsetting 9 times the amount of carbon.
Quite something, isn't it? And there's two things that I think that brings up for me. One is to point out that we should be really clear that none of this is illegal and there's no allegations for any of that. What we're talking about is essentially conflicts of interest, which really amounts to quite poor governance in the end, and the kinds of conflicts of interest that we've seen, I guess, in other government organisations be raised recently across various issues. But also, I think that brings us back, Polly, to some of the problems with the safeguards mechanism itself, as well as some of the problems with offsets, because as you've said, explaining the difference between credits and offsets, credits are great. Avoiding deforestation is something we absolutely want to encourage. There's no problems with any of that. The problem is when it's being used to help expand the fossil fuel industry. So can you just tell us a bit about some of the flaws with the safeguards mechanism that make this story so important to actually reducing Australia's emissions?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll just first emphasise what Nick was saying early on, that this offset, the offset industry in Australia's offset framework, is directly related to the growth of the gas industry in Australia. You know, it crept up on us fairly quietly. We've had offsets for years, and in the same way that the gas industry crept up on us sort of quietly, you know, there was related to, we had lots of state-based approvals, and then, you know, increasing donations from the gas industry to political parties, and then all of a sudden we found ourselves completely captured by the gas industry and having this gas-fired recovery.
Yeah, we went from having cheap and available domestic gas to being, I think, the third biggest exporter of LNG, or the biggest at one point exporter of LNG.
Crept up on us. The same thing has happened with the offsets. So it might look like all of a sudden offsets are front and center, but this whole industry has been growing at the same time that the gas industry has been growing, and it's been no accident. Under the coalition, Grant King was actually tasked with, I will get to your question, but I just feel like really need to create that relationship. Under the coalition, Grant King, former CEO of Origin Energy, of course now chair of the Climate Change Authority, he was advising the government on ways to expand and expedite the supply of carbon offsets available to the gas industry. And a lot of that was, you know, fast-tracking ways of developing credits, cutting red tape, cutting admin, making it easier for farmers to have offset projects, different ways of generating carbon credits, whether it was carbon capture and storage or soil. And so many of the integrity issues that we see now are a direct result of the government's desire to make as many carbon offsets available and as affordable as possible for the fossil fuel industry. And Labor has inherited that legacy, but it actually suits Labor very nicely, as I'll get to, because, of course, they are just as committed to gas expansion as the coalition was, just with some slightly different branding. So this safeguard mechanism, and I'm not going to assume that everyone knows what it is because it's similarly a very obscure and opaque piece of policy.
And I just feel like that's a good point to interrupt and talk about what's that famous quote from John Oliver about if you want to do something really bad, hide it in something very complicated.
Yeah.
And I was going to say that what's so little understood by the public is that under this safeguard mechanism, the biggest polluters in Australia have literally no obligation to cut their emissions. They can offset their emissions to 100%. They don't have to cut a single tonne of emissions. This has to be more broadly understood. No one who's defending this scheme will ever defend that. They don't want to talk about it. That is built into the design of the safeguard mechanism. Anyway, I'll just plant that for people.
Yeah. So we have this. It would seem logical that any emissions reduction policy in Australia would address the biggest driver of climate change, fossil fuel expansion. This thing called the safeguard mechanism is Australia's key emissions reduction policy. However, it's not fundamentally designed to stop increasing emissions from fossil fuels. And as Nick said, it will allow both emissions, both domestic onshore and exported emissions from gas and coal production to increase. The government has explicitly ruled out any stop to new fossil fuel projects in Australia. Apparently the safeguard is going to be the thing that takes care of that. But as you'll see, it effectively provides this illusion of a regulatory kind of regime that fossil fuel industry is subject to, and actually they can increase their emissions. So just to really quickly explain it, safeguard mechanism is a scheme that covers Australia's 200 odd biggest polluters. Between them, they're responsible for about a third of Australia's emissions. It's an arbitrary grouping of facilities across a number of industries. So you do have gas and coal, but you've also got critical minerals, manufacturing. The only thing they've got in common is that they all produce a certain amount of CO2 every year, above 100,000 tonnes. And these facilities have emissions limits or what are called baselines. It's a bit of a confusing description placed on them, which they theoretically have to stay under. And if they can either stay under it by reducing emissions or, changing their business practices, or by purchasing offsets. And if they exceed it, then they have to purchase offsets too. So the government took this, what is a coalition climate policy, which should tell you everything you need to know, and has said that it will gradually reduce those pollution limits, those baselines, every year to 2030. But of course, as Nick said, emissions don't have to be reduced. The cap or limit is completely arbitrary. It can be exceeded infinitely as long as offsets are bought. So a gas and coal company can increase its direct emissions, that's what's being counted here, and its production, its exports or the product that's sold in Australia, as long as it buys some offsets. An entirely new coal mine can open up and be given the same sort of pollution limit as existing facilities. This is a new fossil fuel project that's never existed, that the IEA says should never exist, and it's giving them permission to pollute up to a certain level, again allowing that an increase in emissions, and then once they hit sort of this arbitrary number, then they can purchase some offsets. And coal and gas account for around 50% of emissions from the safeguard mechanism. And opportunities to decarbonise, or I should say the appetite to decarbonise by gas and coal companies, are very limited, and of course they would be very expensive. So what are they going to opt for? Are they going to opt to actually change their business model? Or if the government's got this entire buffet of affordable offsets, which one are they going to choose? And I'll just quickly add to that, Eb. The government is also suppressing the price of offsets. Sorry, am I going on too long? The government's suppressing the price of offsets and is confident that they won't get above $75. Bear in mind that Woodside has an internal carbon price of US $80. So again, it's a no-brainer. What's Woodside going to opt for?
Yeah, so Ebony, the oil and gas companies that were exporting from Australia last year made somewhere in the vicinity of $120 billion last year, right? Their emissions obligations, if they were just to buy offsets at the current price, averaged out over the years to 2030, would be less than $1 billion a year, less than 1 billion for all of the emitters. That's the total abatement cost if they were to buy offsets versus $120 billion that they made in profit. We're talking about coins down the back of the couch, as Marine Faruqi said. So I'm sure members of the public are thinking, well, if you're offsetting it, that's the same as abating, right? But this is where Polly's work's been so critical, and the likes of Andrew McIntosh and the ANU, and then backed up eventually by a CSIRO, by several other scientific organisations. The offsets, the main three ways that the main three methods of offsets that are being purchased and traded at the moment. There's three different methods, and they're all junk.
Yeah, so that was the next thing that I actually wanted to ask you about. I was really struck by the work that you looked into with the integrity issues with offsets that have been raised, as you said, by Andrew McIntosh, by the Australia Institute, Academy of Science, all of these. But even including, you point out here, even companies making money from things like landfill gas drew attention to the fact that they were getting money that they really shouldn't have been. So, yeah, just tell us a little bit more about what some of that research has exposed.
Well, the research has exposed things that the industries that are profiting from it are agreeing with, right? So the landfill gas sector, they came out and they agreed with what Andrew McIntosh was saying, and they literally said, yeah, we're actually getting money for things we've always done. There's something like 20 million credits out there for things that the landfill gas sector was already doing. They agree with the criticism. And then the Clean Energy Regulator says, no, it's actually fine. There's nothing to see here. So that's one of the methods. Another method is avoided deforestation. So this is for farmers who have said they have had permits to clear their land in Western New South Wales is where it almost all is. They have had permits to clear their land, and the fact that they're not clearing it gives them a credit. So they're literally being paid to not do something that they could have done. Now, the land clearing rates are such that if all of those people had actually cleared their land, there wouldn't have been enough, as memorably said in that Australia Institute report, there wouldn't have been enough bulldozers to clear the amount of land that there were permits existing for. So avoided deforestation is when essentially carbon credit aggregators have gone to farmers and they've said, do you have a permit to clear your land? And they've said, yep. And they go, okay, hold that. We're going to get you money for not clearing your land. And they'd be like, well, I wasn't going to clear it anyway. Well, you were now. So this is almost a third of the permits are going to farmers who are saying that they were going to do something that there's no proof that they were going to do. But they're literally doing nothing. They're not planting trees. They're not cutting down. Then they're doing nothing except signing pieces of paper. So there's two of the three main methods. The third one is the human-induced regeneration method. And again, this is not planting trees. It's moving cattle from one section of the land to another, or saying that you're clearing pests from a certain section of land. A lot of them have been issued through in Queensland and New South Wales. But in Queensland, the rates of deforestation have risen in recent years. This is having no effect on the ground. There are people collecting credits for, well, everyone probably knows it's been quite wet in parts of Australia recently. Funnily enough, this has an effect on trees and foliage. So when trees, are growing faster because it's been raining a lot, people collect carbon credits for these things. These are the three main methods. So they make up, 80% of all carbon credits happen in these three methods, and around 70 to 80% of them on the conservative estimates of Andrew McIntosh and their researchers, 70 to 80% of these methods are junk.
I'll just also add land clearing is increased in New South Wales too, and the avoided deforestation method was created to reduce land clearing, but there's some theories it's increased dramatically. There's some theories that now landholders have enough money, and this was admitted by one, from earning carbon credits that they can afford to clear other areas of their property. And I just wanted to add one quick thing, Eb. I know you want to go to questions, but yes, we need to store as much carbon in the soil and in trees and in ecosystems as possible. But fundamentally, the two carbon cycles are not fungible. Biological carbon is different to geological carbon. But there's inherent uncertainty and risk in using nature-based solutions, as they're called, to offset industrial emissions. We're having climate change is causing increasing fires, increasing floods. The risk of reversal is very high, and trying to store infinite amount of carbon in our natural sinks doesn't actually create the structural changes across our economy and across different sectors in terms of decarbonisation and actual emissions reductions.
And just before we go to questions, I did just want to say there was a review, wasn't there, Polly, of carbon credits and to look into some of these issues. What did that find?
That was an interesting one. And I think Stephen Long, the journalist, the other day referred to the review as the strangest government document he'd ever seen in his however many years of journalism, because it was a review that was carried out by the Labor government, and I'll try and keep this quick, but it was it was only ever going to be a short, sharp review, but the government fundamentally couldn't ignore these manifest problems that had been raised, both with the credits themselves, but with the manifest conflicts of interest within the Clean Energy Regulator and how this whole system is administered and overseen. So they commissioned a review. The review panel was chaired by Professor Ian Chubb and three other panelists who appeared at face value, again, not making any aspersions or allegations here, but they all had links to the carbon credit industry. One of them was reported as spruiking carbon credits as an investment opportunity in the media while the review was taking place. Anyway, fast forward, the review gave the whole system a big tick of approval, a clean bill of health. That was the top line. It actually had a number of recommendations that seemed to suggest that there was a lack of transparency, governance issues. One of the carbon credit methods, the avoided deforestation, is being revoked. New projects are no longer allowed to be registered. So there was an acknowledgement of really quite serious fundamental flaws, but the top line was it's all good. And of course, that's what the media reported. Then funnily enough, the next day, Minister Bowen stood up and said, and here's the latest version of the safeguard mechanism that allows 100% use of offsets.
Yeah.
And despite the problems that Chubb identified, all of the credits that have been generated thus far are still to be honoured. So everything that he's, even though he said, well, there are problems with this method, there are problems with that method, and we've got to fix them. Nevertheless, all of those problems have been ignored in terms of the historical credits that have been generated. So I'll give you one example, because someone contacted me when I published this essay, and he said, I've got a piece of land out in Western Victoria, and they bought it in 2021, and when they bought it, they realised that someone had been collecting carbon credits from it. And then, so when they looked into it with the department came and looked at it, and they cancelled the project because all the trees that had been planted had all died. So, but nevertheless, there were 10 years of carbon credits that had been collected from this piece of land, and they're still alive. They're still in the system and being used, despite the fact that the project's been killed. Anyway, from this my correspondent was a bit irritated because it meant that he could no longer, his whole land was ineligible for anything anymore. But that's a different story.
Oh dear. So we might go to questions from the audience now. We've covered quite a lot of flaws and problems with the safeguard mechanism as well as offsets. But I might send this one to you first, Polly. There's a question here from Joe Whitehead asking, what do you suggest the Greens and David Pocock demand from the government? What are some of the ways that the government could actually make this policy legitimately reduce emissions?
Sure, that's excellent, and I've got a million answers, so I'll try and keep it limited. I mean, the first one is it is absolutely bananas that the government is not addressing the number one thing that is making emissions worse. So I think the call for no new gas and coal it's not a political game. It's not a strategy or blackmail. It's science. And for any climate policy to be legitimate or to work, you need to remove that number one thing out of the equation. So everyone should be calling NGOs that there's been a noticeable silence from the environment movement backing the Greens call for no new fossil fuels. The crossbenchers should be going hard on this as well. And in the absence of that, because the thing about the safeguard mechanism is, as I said, it arbitrarily groups the fossil fuel industry with manufacturing and minerals that we actually need. And the fossil fuel industry is kind of wrecking it for everyone. They're blowing the carbon budget for everyone. They're creating these kind of perverse offsetting schemes where offsets are too readily available. So everyone is only going to do the bare minimum, but also these other industries are now going to have to do more, and it's going to be harder for them to decarbonise. If you really wanted the safeguard mechanism to be a legitimate decarbonisation framework or industry policy, then you need to get rid of fossil fuels out of the picture. They need to be dealt with separately. Stop approving new gas and coal, and then have the safeguard mechanism as a robust tool that supports decarbonisation, incentivises and regulates critical minerals and manufacturing. In terms of smaller asks, it's nonsense that the government has refused to release its modelling on how heavily industry is going to rely on offsets according to them. We need transparency around that. I believe that's coming out today because the Senate's mandated it. There should be limits to offsets, of course. There should be incentives for genuinely hard to abate industries. I'm just going
to. They need to look at the governance of offsets as well. Yeah. So both limiting the use of offsets in the legislation, as in the fact that no one wants to talk about that you can offset everything 100% without it reducing any emissions. There has to be a cap on the number of offsets that you can use to meet your emissions reduction obligation. So that to me is a really obvious one. And the other really obvious one is to follow the Chubb Review's recommendations, as in their own review found a lot of problems with the carbon offsetting schemes. They need to be introduced as well, as in so that people believe that offsets are actually abating carbon, because at the moment I don't think people do. I don't.
Yeah, and Nick, you've made another good point that reminds me. David Pocock, for example, has raised concerns about the integrity of carbon credits, but the fact that there is no cap, there are going to be allowing 100% off access to offsets for new polluters, for example, as well as existing ones. And he pointed out that's a scheme shared only in the world by Kazakhstan. That's the only other country that allows that. Like that detail just seems to be kind of missing from this debate.
Well, I think the reason that it's missing is that nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody, most of the major political journalists won't dig into this question. It's very rare that you'll actually find a Labor MP. They won't openly come out and say, I believe in the unlimited use of offsets to meet our reductions obligations. They're relying on the fact that that most people don't even understand that. They do not want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about the fact that most emissions on exports are not counted, as in that all of the emissions on, like, for example, the new Woodside project, Scarborough, Pluto, that project, that alone would produce more emissions by a long shot per year than all of the abatement that will happen theoretically under the safeguard mechanism. Like, these are things. Sorry.
just going to say super quickly, even the direct emissions from new fossil fuel projects, someone at work was doing a rough calculation the other day, the direct emissions onshore are going to eclipse the entire 205 million tonnes that are allegedly going to be reduced by the safeguard. And you're right, no one in government has addressed that fundamental maths. They just ignore it.
Just ignore it. It's all politics. That these are the defences of the safeguard mechanism. You'll see from the Labor Party, they're all about the politics. They're about the crazy Greens and people. They don't want to talk about it. So it's our obligation, as much as possible, to make people understand that they're not counting most emissions, that new coal and gas is being enabled by this system, and that offsets are essentially a very, very bad idea for actual reducing emissions and improving, the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah, I think Richard Dennis, our executive director in the Senate inquiry, a cap and trading scheme without a cap. Polly, the next question I've got is from Greg Ebeling, who says there are industries like concrete, which are responsible for enormous emissions, but the technology does not yet exist to provide an alternative or for them to decarbonise. How will industries like cement achieve that if there are no carbon offsets? If you could just address that issue for us, please.
Yeah, that's a really fair call. But it goes back to what I was saying before. There are genuinely hard to abate industries like concrete and like steel, although there was a paper published recently, showing that hydrogen can produce clean steel. I thoroughly accept that. But do you think the government is actually putting money into R&D to do research about potentially decarbonising? Do you think that it's the concrete and steel industries that are buying the carbon credits? Because it's not. It's the gas industry. The gas and coal industry is where all the demand is coming from, and that's what has led to these fundamental integrity issues. We may never be able to get something like concrete down to zero emissions, but that's why it's so important that we tackle the low-hanging fruit, like fossil fuels, like energy efficiency, so that there is a bit of a buffer room for things like agriculture and cement and those other, critical minerals mining that we actually need. I'm absolutely not suggesting no offsets.
Yeah, those hard to abate sectors are the reason that offsets exist. If there's a hierarchy of mitigation, as they call it, that most of it needs to come from cuts, and most of those cuts are from fossil fuel industry. And offsets were designed really in the mind of the scientists who originally came up with the idea, were that there were some hard to abate sectors. I don't think anyone disagrees with the fact, but if you are going to try to abate those hard to abate sectors, you want to also make sure that the offsets are real.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be really clear for everyone, there are sectors like concrete that are super hard to abate, and no one is suggesting that they shouldn't have access, but offsets are supposed to be a last resort, and they're supposed to be for those industries, not for every company to kind of go to an offset before they even try to reduce their emissions. Would that be accurate, Polly?
Yeah, and I'm just looking at a comment in the chat here that said the fossil fuel industry is not low-hanging fruit. To be clear, the fossil fuel industry is not buying offsets in good faith while it changes its business model or shifts to renewable energy. It's using offsets to justify opening new gas basins. Like the Beetaloo Basin was never going to be a thing until it was recommended that, offsets have to be bought and then you can make it happen. The last thing we should be doing is opening up new gas and oil fields on the premise that some of the emissions can be offset. They're not being used to phase down their business model.
No, yeah. 96% of oil and gas companies have expansion plans, actually.
Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? Given that the whole objective of this safeguard mechanism is to reduce emissions. That's the number one thing that it should be doing. So if it's not doing that bare minimum, we've got a big problem, don't we?
Yeah, and I'll just add super quickly, outside of the safeguard, government policy is planning on pumping out as many offsets as it can. So the government is actually making offsetting easy under the safeguard. It's not what can we do? The offsets exist. I guess buy them if you want. They are actively putting the supply out there and keeping this price low.
I've got a couple of other questions here just about emissions by these big emitters and if those are accurate. Polly, we know in the past big emitters have a history of using accounting tricks to talk about our emissions reduction. So John Knox has asked, before we even start talking about offsets, how do we guarantee that emissions reported by big emitters are actually accurate? And how does the government check on these things?
That is an excellent question, and that should be something that the crossbench is demanding to know, that are these emissions being reported to the government actually accurate? And as we're finding out that actually the amount of methane that we have assumed is coming out of open-cut coal mines is probably a gross underestimation. So in Australia, the way that we calculate emissions from big emitting facilities or corporates is fairly rudimentary. It's done kind of companies are required to report to the government, but they use basically emissions factors or equations to work out, and it can be like they can do, real live monitoring of how much methane is coming from a mine underground, or else they can do an equation on the back of an envelope. We don't know how accurate our emissions reporting even is across any sector, and that should be something that we get right first. Do we actually know how much methane or how much CO2 that these facilities are actually emitting? And that's why we should be extra risk averse in terms of how we manage these facilities, because if we're getting those numbers wrong, if it turns out 10 years after the fact that actually huge amounts of methane have been leaking out of all these facilities and our emissions are actually 100 million tonnes more than we thought they were, but we've let them go ahead on the basis that they offset their emissions, we're in real trouble there.
Well, various reports have come out recently saying that methane is being drastically undercounted in certain places. It just makes a mockery of the Chris Bowen position that gas is somehow a transitional fuel. There's nothing transitional about methane. It's a lot worse in the short term. In the short term is what we're trying to sort of address. The methane is it's very, very bad for the environment. There is a lot of it. It's not like gas is cleaner when you're exporting like 1.4 billion tonnes of it. That's not clean, and that's not a transition. You've literally added percentage points worth of emissions to Australia's national emissions. There is nothing transitional about gas.
Yeah.
And the one thing that just needs to be said over and over, there is no shortage of gas in Australia. This is gas the gas that is going into these new projects is all for export. 80% above is for export. If Australia has a gas problem, it's because we keep exporting it. If they don't want to put a gas reserve policy in place, then, don't use that as an excuse not to reduce our emissions.
Yeah, there was a fantastic clip from, I think, Estimates recently where a gas industry executive told the Senate, we've really got to look into this because there's a domestic gas shortage and it's pushing up energy prices in Australia. And Senator Pocock asked him, he said, and how much of your project is going to be for domestic consumption? Oh, no, actually, Senator, currently it's all for export. We're an export project.
Yeah,
that's
really
up on
going to help.
I think if anyone wants to see that. But the next question, Polly, is from Lorraine Bull, and it's on my personal favourite element of climate policy, which is carbon capture and storage. I've been in politics for 20 years. I'm old now. I've been hearing about carbon capture and storage for that whole 20 years. In my experience, it's always 10 years away. Lorraine says the hydrogen energy supply chain project in the Latrobe Valley will proceed to commercial stage and is expected to produce about 1.8 million tonnes of CO2, which will be stored under Bass Strait. Polly, will they get carbon credits for this? And is there any way that carbon capture and storage can be used as an offset under this scheme?
So my colleague Mark Ogue has written a fantastic paper about this HESC scheme. I highly recommend going and checking it out after this. That project is filthy. And that's not a pejorative. There is fewer, more polluting processes than hydrogen made from brown coal gasification. That project is just nonsense. Look, I haven't seen it be proposed that it would get carbon credits, but actually it's quite possible that Australia and Japan could come up with some agreement under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, which is this bilateral carbon trading deals. So you've manifested it now, you've said it. So it wouldn't surprise me if someone comes up with that idea. I really hope not. In terms of carbon capture and storage, the Australian government, has been talking about CCS for decades. The world has been talking about carbon capture and storage for decades. To be clear, carbon capture and storage started off as something called enhanced oil recovery. It was a way of pushing CO2 underground and which would get residual oil up and out. And that's what it was designed for. It was never designed for storing CO2 permanently underground, and it has never worked. It's used predominantly as a PR tool, and it's another thing like offsets where Woodside or Santos says, look, we can keep producing gas, or the government says they can keep producing gas because they're building this carbon capture and storage facility. The one we do have in Australia operating has been an abject failure and has resulted in so much more pollution than it ever captured. And CCS is also only ever meant to capture, a small fraction of residual emissions that come out of the ground when you're extracting something else. So it doesn't ever capture everything coming out of a facility.
CCS, 20 years, still hasn't arrived, massively expensive, huge failure so far wherever it's been tried in association with trying to bury CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. I did just want to finish back on governance, basically. We've heard a lot about the problems with the integrity of offsets. Nick, a lot of your essay is, again, about all these close links with the fossil fuel industry and government, with the fossil fuel industry and regulators, and kind of through links with carbon offsets and then environment groups as well. What's your overall impression at the end of writing this essay of some of these big issues that we have to tackle, and how does it compare to something like things that we've seen like robo-debt and other governance issues that have come up in various ways in recent years?
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. I've been thinking a lot about the way systems are sort of designed to be necessarily complex, and they're designed in a way that you have to be a kind of expert to even get a vague sense of what's actually happening. In the case of the offsets industry, the effort to bury data and to not make it available is ongoing. It's immense. The complexity of these methods are such that they're both almost impossible to understand unless you're, both an accountant, an environmentalist, and a physicist with a sideline in biology. But they're so complex that it actually means there are huge holes in these methods as well. But in a governance sense, it looks like the entire edifice has been designed to avoid transparency, to make it difficult to understand, to turn members of the public off trying to actually understand it. It looks like these methods have been co-designed by the industry with the regulator. Over and over, there are examples of this. There doesn't seem to be any independence, and there seems to be a very small group of players that sort of move in different roles at different times. So you've got people, ex-department people going to work for carbon aggregators, all sorts of strange movements between a very small industry. Look, the fact that the regulator, the clean energy regulator, is on its own industry lobby group. It's a member of its own industry lobby group, the Carbon Markets Institute. It puts money into the Carbon Markets Institute. I think that says as much as I need to know.
Yeah, and just a reminder, this is what this month's issue of the monthly looks like. Please check it out. We haven't done justice to the amazing amount of detail that's in this essay. It's so easy to read. I was highlighting every second paragraph when I was preparing for this. But Polly, that brings me back to, we recently had a climate integrity summit. One of the key things that you said we need to ensure climate integrity was simplicity. what would simplicity look like in our current debate if we wanted to ensure climate integrity?
Simplicity would just mean absolute reductions. Stop doing the bad stuff. Stop creating these incredibly complex, opaque frameworks that are fundamentally used to justify bad stuff. Stop doing the bad stuff and do the good stuff. I know that sounds really obvious, but that's what climate policy should be. I was just going to quickly mention, going back to our summit, carbon credits are financial instruments. Can you imagine any other part of the financial sector carrying on like this? The level, the conflicts, the complexity, the corruption. This is subprime mortgage territory that we're in now. There are investments being made on this. This is worth billions and billions of dollars, which explains why people are so keen to hide it. But this is not just about emissions. This is an economic issue too.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that the ACCC has just announced, it's going to be looking into greenwashing claims. So definitely one to keep an eye on. We are going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Nick Feik and Polly Hemming, for your time today. Thank you, everyone who's joined. We really appreciate you joining us today and being part of this really important public policy discussion. You can write to your local MP, whether they are Labor, Greens, Independent, Liberal, but certainly I would recommend writing to the Climate and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen. Get in contact with your local member to talk about this issue. It's not too late to have an impact on the political process. Head on over to the Australia Institute's website at australiainstitute.org.au for all of our research into the safeguard mechanism, junk offsets and credits. We've got explainer videos. You can find all of that information on our website. Thanks again for being part of today's discussion. We hope we've done justice to Nick's fantastic essay. Don't forget to go out and buy a copy today. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Seb.
This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 8th of March, 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you can find our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Nick is at Nick Feik, spelled F-E-I-K. Polly is at Polly J. Hemming, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.